Welcome to the Mystery Shack, where the mundane collides with the mysterious. Tonight, we unravel the haunting tale of Andrew Eriks, a man whose life took a dark turn with a seemingly trivial choice: the decision to stop carrying his backpack. What began as an ordinary day soon spiraled into a nightmare beneath the streets of New York, as Andrew wandered deeper into the twisting tunnels of the city's subway system. His obsession with the enigmatic strangers lurking in the shadows began to consume him, pulling him into a world where reality melts into the surreal. Brace yourself for a story that will challenge your grasp on reality. Stay with us as the mystery begins to unravel. My name is Andrew Eriks. I once lived in New York City. My mother, Terry Eriks, is still there. Her name is in the phone book. If you know the city and you're reading this, please find her. Don't show her this, but tell her that I love her and that I'm doing everything I can to come home. Please. It all started when I turned 25 and decided it was time to stop taking my backpack to work. I thought I'd look more mature without lugging around a bag like some high school kid. Of course, this meant giving up my habit of reading on the subway, since paperbacks don't exactly fit in your pocket. A briefcase would have been ridiculous, considering I worked in a factory, and messenger bags just felt well, let's say they weren't my style. Too much like a purse. I had an MP3 player for a while, which made the commutes bearable, but when it broke, shutting down after every song unless I skipped tracks manually, I gave that up too. So each morning I sat through a half-hour commute that felt like an eternity, with nothing to do but watch my fellow passengers. I wasn't the most outgoing person, so I kept my people watching discreet. But soon, I noticed something. There were others like me who were clearly uncomfortable in public, each hiding it in their own way. I started categorizing them in my head. There were the fidgeters, constantly shifting, adjusting their seats, moving their legs, fiddling with their hands, as if they couldn't find a moment of ease. They were the most obviously nervous. Then came the fake sleepers, the ones who closed their eyes the second they sat down. Most weren't actually asleep. The real sleepers would stir at every stop, waking momentarily at noises or when the train jolted. The fakes? They just shut down, immobile, until their stop appeared like magic. Then there were the MP3 addicts, the occasional laptop users, the groups of friends who talked way too loudly, and the cell phone junkies who either had the busiest social lives imaginable or just couldn't stop talking for even a minute. Just when I thought people watching had reached its limit of predictability, I spotted something that didn't quite fit in. The man I noticed was middle-aged, with brown hair, average in size and weight, and dressed casually. But what struck me most was how utterly normal he appeared. Too normal, almost as if designed to blend in seamlessly. No defining features, no tics or quirks. Nothing. It was as if he existed merely to occupy space, like background noise that your brain registers but doesn't really hear. In a subway car full of the restless and the distracted, he stood out by doing nothing at all. He sat, unmoving, like someone staring blankly at a TV screen without really watching it, not invested in whatever was happening around him. I only started noticing him about a month into my people-watching experiment, and even then, it took a while because I didn't always ride the same train or sit in the same car. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it, but when I spotted him again that Thursday, in the same seat, it was impossible to ignore. His routine was too precise. Always the same train, always the same car, always the same seat. At first, I joked to myself that he must have OCD or something. But the more I observed him, the more unsettling he became. He didn't do anything. He didn't fidget, didn't react. His face remained blank. His head fixed straight ahead no matter what was going on around him. Even when a frazzled woman entered the car with a screaming child and sat directly behind him, he didn't flinch. He didn't turn, didn't grimace, nothing. The kid's shrieks were piercing, loud enough to make anyone's head throb, but he just sat there like he was made of stone. By the time I reached my stop, I felt physically ill. My stomach churned, and my hands trembled as I stepped off the train, shaken by a deep, irrational sense that something about this man was profoundly wrong. I couldn't shake the thought that he was a sociopath, the kind of quiet guy who would seem perfectly harmless until you found out he had a freezer full of human heads at home. For the next couple of weeks, I did everything I could to avoid seeing him again. I lingered after work, pretending to browse kiosks at the mall near the station, or I deliberately picked train cars far away from the one I'd seen him in. I felt a strange kind of relief each time I didn't encounter him. Then one morning it happened again. This time it wasn't him, but a woman. Plain-looking, unremarkable, but just as unsettling. She exuded that same eerie stillness, that same feeling of not belonging in the world around her. The second I noticed her, something clicked, and I realized it wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, more obsessive. My casual people-watching hobby had transformed into something more, an obsession that consumed me. I couldn't board a subway or hop on a bus without scanning the faces around me, silently checking off boxes in my mind. Plain clothes in muted colors, no visible logos or brands. Check. Blank faces, no idle glances out the window or at fellow passengers. Check. No bags, purses, or anything that suggested a normal life. Check. Another one. Another stranger. They weren't always there, but often enough to keep me on edge. I found myself taking the subway more frequently, riding it far beyond my usual stops, even detouring onto buses I didn't need. And every time I spotted one, the same anxiety gripped me, making my skin prickle and my throat tighten like I was moments away from a public speech. The strangers never acknowledged me, yet I felt exposed in their presence, as if I were the one being observed. I could see them, so stark, so obvious. How could they not see me? But they didn't. Not once did they so much as glance my way. Eventually, my curiosity outweighed the fear, and I decided to follow one. Naturally, I chose the man from that first encounter, the one who sat in the same seat day after day like a fixture of the subway itself. This time, I boarded the train and took a seat behind him, my heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and excitement. We rode to the end of the line. When the train stopped, he stood and exited without a glance back. I trailed him, keeping a safe distance, but instead of heading anywhere, he simply sat down on a nearby bench, still as ever. I ducked around a corner, pretending to fumble with my phone while sneaking glances. Minutes passed. Another train pulled in and he boarded again, taking the exact same seat as before. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just riding the subway back and forth, endlessly looping through the city. Why? Why would anyone do that? The question gnawed at me, even as I abandoned my pursuit and boarded the next train home. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting there, motionless, locked in a senseless routine. My confusion turned to anger, irrational, but fierce. What was the point of it? What could possibly drive someone to spend their days like this, an almost mechanical existence? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I'd read somewhere that the human brain recoils from things that feel fundamentally wrong, like the way a giant spider triggers instant disgust. We recognize something is off, alien. That's what the strangers were becoming to me. They weren't just odd or peculiar anymore. They felt like an insult to reality itself. They didn't belong, and the very sight of them offended my senses. I followed him again the next day, and then the day after that. Every day, for at least a week, we made our silent trips together, though only I was aware of it. By the end of that week, I was spending hours tracking him, until the last train that stopped near my apartment block each night. We rode from one end of the city to the other, then back again over and over. It wasn't about people watching anymore. I was watching him, just him. My focus was so intense that the rest of the world faded away. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of confused passengers noticing me, but I didn't care. To me, it felt like we were the only two people left in existence. I lost my job the following week. My manager, kind, soft-spoken, but resolute, said I wasn't focusing, wasn't being productive. He gave a long, rehearsed speech, but I barely registered a word of it. My thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by my new, self-appointed task, my vigil. What was that man, that thing, doing when I wasn't there to observe him? Was he riding the subway endlessly, even when I wasn't around? The questions gnawed at me. I left work at noon that day, earlier than usual. Normally, I wouldn't start following him until the evening commute, but something pulled at me. I knew he would be waiting for me, just as he always was. Looking back now, I wonder why I didn't seize the moment, why I didn't take that day as a chance to step away. It was summer after all. I could have wandered downtown, admired the city, maybe even chatted up some girls, enjoyed a coffee in the sun. I could have tried to forget him, pushed the growing obsession out of my mind, found a new job and moved on with my life. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. Multiple trains ran through that station, so I sat there for over an hour, scanning every car that passed by. And then I saw him through the window like always. I boarded the train, but this time, something was different. For the first time, I didn't feel the anxiety that had usually coursed through me. My hands were steady, my skin wasn't clammy, and my heart didn't race. I took a seat directly across from him, locking eyes with him, daring him to acknowledge me. I stared at him, hard, waiting for some flicker of recognition, some sign that he knew I existed. But if he did, he gave no indication. His face was as blank, as unresponsive, as ever. We must have been quite the sight, the two of us, sitting across from each other, locked in a silent stare, as if the entire world outside the train had ceased to exist. Inside, my rage bubbled up, threatening to distort my expression. But I held it in check, forcing myself to remain as still, as expressionless as he was. Yet, inside I was screaming, "React to me, you fucking asshole. See me, damn it. See me. I didn't know you for what you were." But I told myself I did, and I clung to that delusion, demanding some kind of response, some recognition from him. It didn't come. Not during the first loop or the second or the 10th. The hours bled together as we rode deep into the night. At each terminus, we both stepped off, only to wait in silence for the next train. I sat beside him on the cold bench, glancing at him from the corner of my eye, but he never once acknowledged me. His indifference should have unnerved me, but it only stoked the fire inside me. Two could play this game. Finally, we were on our last ride of the night. This time, I felt it. Something was about to change. The trains were about to stop running, and I wasn't going to let him slip away like all the nights before. Usually, when we reached the end of the line, I would watch him vanish into the shadows while I scrambled to catch the last bus home. But not tonight. Tonight, I would follow him. I would see where he went when the world fell silent and the city exhaled its final breath. I would finally uncover his truth. As the subway rumbled forward, my anticipation built, tightening in my chest. The other passengers trickled out at each stop, until it was just the two of us in the dim, flickering light of the train car. Below the surface of the city, we rode together, two silent figures locked in an unspoken battle of wills. I had to fight the insane urge to grin as the train began to slow for the final time. We had reached the end of the line. The doors hissed open, but he didn't move. Neither did I. The car was still, save for the occasional distant shuffle of feet as the last of the stragglers disappeared into the night. The PA system chimed to announce the terminus, but the sound felt distant, like a whisper in a dream. The station outside was empty. The air hung heavy with a waiting silence. And then footsteps, steady, deliberate, growing closer. A conductor, checking the cars to make sure they were empty before locking up for the night. I didn't dare take my eyes off him, the stranger, my quarry, but I saw the conductor out of the corner of my eye. He stepped into our car, glanced at us, and then stopped. His brows furrowed, and for a moment, he just stood there, blinking as if something wasn't quite right. I waited, breathless, for him to speak. The pause dragged on, heavy with tension. But then, with a small shake of his head, the conductor left without a word, moving on to the next car. The train jerked to life again, rolling slowly through the underground labyrinth until it finally came to a halt. We had been parked. Outside the window, I saw rows of other subway cars, empty and still, lined up in silent rows. Through one window I could see into the next car, and then into another and another. It was as if the train stretched into infinity, a maze of steel and glass where time stood still. And then he moved. It was subtle at first, just the slightest curl of his lips. A smile. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't spent hours memorizing every line of his face. My heart thundered in my chest as he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine for the first time. "So," he said, his voice a gravelly, low rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. "Here we are." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of fear pressing down on me. It felt like the whole underground world was closing in, suffocating me in its endless silence. I coughed, stammered, and finally forced out the question that had haunted me through sleepless nights, the question that had driven me here. What are you?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stood, and as if on cue, the train doors slid open. I wasn't expecting what happened next. He turned, just for a moment, and looked directly at me. "Coming?" he asked, his voice as indifferent as before. He didn't wait for my answer and stepped off the train. I scrambled after him, my pulse racing. "Wait!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the cavernous station. "Talk to me. Who are you? What the hell are you? Why do you ride the subway all night?" My questions poured out, desperate and wild. But he didn't stop, didn't even flinch. His pace never changed, his posture as calm and composed as ever. I was shouting into a void. As we walked down the platform, I fell into step behind him, my voice trailing off into silence. It became clear I wasn't going to get any more out of him. 5 words, that was all he'd given me. 5 cryptic words, leaving me with more questions than before. We reached a junction and turned, now walking between endless rows of trains. The ceiling above was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the gleaming steel around us. The trains stretched on and on, a labyrinth of cars that seemed impossible. Far too many for any single city to need. But by then, logic felt irrelevant. I lost track of time. I used to wear a watch, but it had stopped working long ago. I pulled out my phone, hoping for some sense of grounding, but there was no signal. Just the taunting message, "No service." The stranger would pause every so often, examining a subway car for a few minutes before moving on. Took me a while to notice, but not all the trains were the same. Some were slightly larger, some smaller. The designs of the cockpits varied subtly, like relics from different times, different places. I had no idea what he was looking for, but after what felt like hours, or maybe it was only minutes, he seemed to find it. He stopped in front of a car, and without hesitation, the doors slid open as if waiting for him. He stepped inside, and I followed, taking a seat across from him. I leaned forward, my voice a whisper of frustration. "Will you talk to me now?" But once again, there was no reply. I sighed in frustration, seriously debating the pros and cons of punching him right in the face when suddenly, the lights flickered on, and I heard the hum of the engine kicking to life. "What the hell?" I muttered, more to myself than to him. He looked at me then, a strange sadness flickering behind his otherwise indifferent expression. "You're not going to be able to go back." My heart skipped. "What are you talking about? Go back where?" But once again, I was met with silence. The same maddening silence that had followed me since the start. The train lurched forward, this time heading in the opposite direction from where we had come, or at least I thought it was. By now, the endless maze of trains had scrambled my sense of direction beyond repair. It rolled for what felt like minutes, then began to slow as we approached a station. Something in his vacant gaze shifted. His eyes, cold and distant before, now focused on me with unsettling intensity. "Be still. Be silent. Don't draw their attention." The train halted, the doors slid open, and they began to board. I don't know what hit me first. The oddness of their clothes, the grotesquely elongated arms with fingers that nearly brushed the floor, the jet-black eyes set deep in angular, almost skeletal faces, or the eerie blue-gray tint of their skin. It all hit me at once, and for a heartbeat, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. But when reality sank in, it hit like a sledgehammer. I barely managed to stifle the scream that clawed at my throat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might tear through my chest. Panic gripped me. I was a wire stretched too tight, vibrating on the edge of snapping. My vision swam, nausea overwhelmed me, and before I knew it, I was gagging, forcing myself to swallow the bile that rose in my throat. The stranger's words echoed in my mind like a desperate mantra. "Be still. Be silent. Don't draw their attention." Time blurred. We rode that subway car up and down the line, if it was even a line anymore. I couldn't tell where we were or how long we'd been there. The grotesque creatures surrounding us seemed oblivious to our presence, though it felt impossible that they didn't notice. I could feel the sweat pooling on my skin, every muscle locked in terror, but somehow I stayed motionless. When the train finally returned to the vast, endless cavern of cars, and we were alone again, something in me broke. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Tears poured from me, every ounce of fear and despair I had held in spilling out in heaving sobs. The stranger stood over me, watching with that same impassive gaze, offering no comfort. Eventually, I forced myself to stop. My body shook as I wiped my face with trembling hands and looked up at him, my voice hoarse and broken. "Take me home," I begged, barely above a whisper. "Please." His expression didn't change. "I can't," he said quietly. "I don't know which one of these would take you back, if any of them even do." He stood and walked out onto the platform, and I, weary and defeated, rose to follow. But before I could take more than a few steps, he spun around, his face hard, his voice sharper than before. "I think you've followed me enough." The rage I'd buried beneath layers of fear and confusion surged up again, unstoppable. "What?" I screamed, rushing at him, the dam inside me breaking. Grabbing him by the shoulders, I slammed him against the side of a metro car with a strength I didn't know I had. "You son of a bitch! What the hell did you do to me?" Again, I slammed him, my fury fueling the desperate blows. "Take me back," I shouted, my voice cracking, but he just stood there, taking it all with the same infuriating calm. My anger burned bright, then fizzled, leaving me hollow. I loosened my grip, my hands trembling. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse, broken. "Please take me home." He looked at me with an unsettling calm, his voice low and resigned. That's not how it works. If we stay together, it's more likely they'll notice us. Go your own way. Be still. Be subtle. If you're lucky, they'll think you're one of theirs. I stared at him, feeling the hopelessness wash over me. How could you do this? Why? His eyes softened, almost sad. I had to. You will too. You get stuck sometimes. He brushed my hands from his shoulders, the gentleness of the gesture at odds with the nightmare I was trapped in. Then, without another word, he turned and started walking away. I collapsed to my knees, all strength drained from me. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the endless tunnels. Just before he vanished from sight, he glanced back, his face etched with something that almost resembled regret. "I'm sorry," he said softly, and then he was gone. For a long time, I stayed there, curled up on the cold, unforgiving tiles, sobbing until my body had no more tears to give. I must have slept, because when I woke, the train was gone. So were the creatures it had carried. The thought of returning to that nightmare-filled train made my skin crawl. Couldn't go back, not to that. So, I wandered, trying to retrace my steps, though the labyrinthine tunnels made every direction feel wrong. I walked for what felt like hours, aimlessly searching for something, anything that looked familiar. Finally, I stumbled upon a train that seemed vaguely recognizable, or maybe I was just so desperate I convinced myself it did. The doors slid open, and I climbed aboard, sinking into a seat with a weary sigh. The train began to move, and though I'd never been much of a believer, I prayed. I prayed with everything in me that this would take me home. When it slowed to a stop and the doors opened, I dared to hope. I saw people, real people. My heart soared, a desperate prayer of gratitude forming on my lips. But then I saw it, the third eye large and unblinking, right in the center of their foreheads. "Well, fuck you then, God," I muttered bitterly under my breath. Still, they weren't as bad as the last creatures. I could handle this. At least their eyes, well, two of them, looked vaguely human, though the way that third eye blinked, out of sync with the others, sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. And when one of them smiled, laughed, or spoke, I couldn't help but notice their teeth. Sharp, misshapen, and yellow-green with filth. But if I squinted and pretended otherwise, I could almost convince myself I was home. Until one of them appeared with a sandwich in hand, and the gnawing realization hit me. I was starving, having not eaten or drunk anything for what felt like days. At the next terminus, I decided I had to find something to eat or drink. I couldn't explain why I waited, but it seemed crucial to ride to the end of the line. Once there, I struggled to summon the courage to leave. I had never seen the stranger leave the underground, nor had I witnessed him eat or drink. My stomach, however, was relentless. I steeled myself, keeping my face as neutral as possible, and ventured out into the station. The confusion hit immediately. I searched for escalators, stairs, or any semblance of a conventional exit, but all I saw were gaping, irregular holes in the ground, walls, and ceiling, like I was inside a massive beehive. What was I supposed to do? Jump into one? It made no sense until someone emerged from a hole, floating up through the floor and passing by me. He frowned, or at least I think it was a frown, but whatever kept them from recognizing me as an outsider in the subway seemed to extend this far. Unfortunately, it didn't grant me the ability to levitate, which appeared to be the only means of escaping the bizarre station. Frustrated, I retreated back to the tunnel. Anger, disorientation, and hunger overwhelmed me, and I felt abandoned to a fate that, if not worse than hell, was at least twice as absurd and 3 times as confusing. In such a state, my lapse in judgment was perhaps forgivable. Normally, I take corners with caution, knowing that a sharp turn in a public place often leads to colliding with someone. And that's exactly what happened. I crashed into a woman and fell to the ground, reacting as any New Yorker might. Badly. I shouted, "Jesus, fuck, you stupid bitch. Watch where you're going." Even before she could react, I realized my blunder. Her eyes widened with confusion and then horror as she truly took in my presence. She recoiled, floated quickly, away from me and emitted a scream-like sound. A shrill, yowling scream pierced the air, sharper than anything I was used to, but the message was clear. As I sprinted down the tunnel, I noticed grotesque, three-eyed heads turning in our direction. The sight of their sharp, filthy teeth ignited a primal fear within me, and in an instant, I was running for my life. The subway train was nowhere in sight, but I spotted a narrow walkway along the tunnel, presumably for maintenance workers, or at least that's how it would be back home. I raced along it, pushing myself to the limit until each breath felt like it was tearing at my lungs. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I looked back. The tunnel had curved, hiding the light from view, but there was no sign of anyone pursuing me. Retracing my steps was no longer an option. I continued forward into the darkness, my exhaustion and despair growing with every step. Eventually, I found a small alcove in the wall and collapsed there, utterly drained. My hunger, fear, and the relentless, panicked run had left me too weak to cry again, though the thought of doing so seemed like an insurmountable task. I slumped against the wall, legs sprawled out, and let my mind drift to a dark fantasy of exacting revenge on the stranger with a hammer. It was a grim, yet oddly comforting thought. In the oppressive dark, I heard a rat scurrying nearby. At first, I would kick out my foot to keep it at bay, but soon even that seemed too much effort. Any disease it might carry would be a mere blessing compared to the endless nightmare of wandering through these alien subways, lost and alone. As the rat ventured closer, I didn't bother to shoo it away. When it brushed against my leg, I was too defeated to react. That is, until a train roared past, its lights flooding the culvert I was in, and revealing the creature I had mistaken for a rat. It was indeed rat-like, but more disturbing was its spider-like appearance. If someone had crossbred a rat and a spider, this abomination would have been the result. I let out a horrified scream, leaped from the ground, and kicked it with all my strength. It collided with the opposite wall with a sickening crunch, twitching violently before the final car passed and darkness enveloped the tunnel once more. In that engulfing darkness, a horrifying thought took root. I wondered if the rat spider might be edible. The very idea made me gag, but hunger gnawed at me with relentless insistence. There was no guarantee of finding food in this strange place, or ever again. Rat spider might be my only option. I held off as long as I could, but eventually, survival won over my squeamishness. I had my lighter, but nothing to ignite. I picked at the meat of the rat spider's carcass, holding it over the flame, but it was barely cooked and did nothing to improve the taste. The meat was as foul as anything you could imagine, more repugnant than anything I've had to eat since. In my desperation, I've consumed many other questionable things, but nothing has ever compared to the horror of that rat spider. Looking back, that moment marked my transformation into a stranger. I had struggled to attain the same blank expression as those who had guided me. What I mistook for calm was nothing more than numbness. Just as a sharp rock smooths out over time from the relentless flow of water, my experiences had eroded my edges. The act of tearing apart and eating that monster in the suffocating darkness of an alien world had finally worn me down. When I emerged from the shadows back into the tunnel, I had become as expressionless and empty as the one who had led me here. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real horror came later, the first time I got stuck. The stranger had warned me, but in my dazed state, I barely registered it. One night, at the end of the line, I was instructed to leave the train. The world I entered was almost normal. The inhabitants were nearly human in appearance, orange-skinned and hunchbacked, but otherwise they resembled people. After the grotesque six-breasted, noseless hermaphrodites of the last world, these orange beings were a relief. At first, I thought the conductor must have been addressing someone else, but I was the only passenger. To my surprise, I understood his words. When I stood up, I realized why. I couldn't stand upright. I was hunched over, and as I saw in the window's reflection as I exited, my skin had turned orange. I quickly understood that being stuck meant I was trapped in this world, forced to look like them. This transformation would be useful if I wanted to leave the subway station. A process that's possible but requires immense care and is quite overwhelming. Alien worlds are unsettling. The differences from your own are so vast that they induce a deep sense of revulsion. I left the subway station, resigned to the fact that I wouldn't be returning to the central hub, the sprawling, eternal line of trains that I had come to know. Or so I thought. It soon became apparent that whatever had kept me undetected was no longer effective. I briefly entertained the idea of staying, but this place was not my home, nor could it ever be. Despite their similar appearance, their culture was bound to be alien. I had learned that lesson the hard way. Once, in a world where people looked strikingly similar to me, well, they looked Brazilian, which was close enough, I made the mistake of using a gesture that was meant as a friendly greeting but was interpreted as a grave insult. The result? I was beaten half to death while a crowd looked on with approval. Even if I could somehow blend in with their culture, I had no desire to stay. My only goals were to either find my way back home or track down the stranger who had set me on this hellish path and exact my revenge. Nothing else would suffice. Determined to move on, I grappled with the thought of inflicting on someone else the same fate I had suffered. Could I really do that? As it turned out, I didn't have to. After a few months, one of the locals did notice me and began to follow. I was careful to make it seem like I hadn't seen him, just as the stranger had done to me. However, I was torn between warning him away and leading him to the end of the line to escape this grim world myself. On the final night, he followed me to the terminus, mirroring my own past actions. Yet, he didn't muster the courage to sit directly across from me. As soon as the train halted, he fled. I waited, hoping the conductor wouldn't see me, but my luck ran out. The metro departed without me, and I cursed my misfortune. As I turned the corner toward the ticket booths, the young man who had been trailing me attacked. Armed with a wicked, curved knife, he should have caught me off guard, but years of traversing hostile alien worlds had sharpened my reflexes. We engaged in a brutal struggle, and eventually I managed to disarm him. I don't know how the knife ended up in his neck. I don't think I wanted to kill him. I hadn't even been that angry, not when I thought back to the rage I had felt so long ago. But as I looked down at his lifeless body, the anger surged anew. I kicked him repeatedly, my voice raw with fury. "You bastard! You were supposed to follow me. Kick." I fled the scene, but my escape was short-lived. By dawn, I was back, waiting to catch the first subway of the morning. That night, as I rode it to the end of the line, I was invisible once more. It seemed that in this place you could either kill someone or bring them along if you wanted to return to the central hub. Though invisible, I remained orange and hunchbacked. I stayed that way until I found myself stuck again. This time, I didn't wait for her to follow. Once I was recognized as a stranger, I identified her as the next target, and I made my choice. I wouldn't drag anyone else into this nightmare. I can't help but wonder about the stranger who ensnared me. What did he look like? And did he know he could have killed me? I also ponder the others I saw back home and the rare few I encounter since leaving. Do they kill or take their victims? And do they see it as an act of mercy? I can't bring myself to ask them. We're damned either way, and the damned should suffer in solitude. I've killed 15 of them now, and I've become quite skilled at it. But I've made a decision. I'm done with killing innocents, at least. Before I returned to the central hub, I filled a backpack with as much paper as it could hold and wrote this story. Over and over, I penned it, leaving it in as many subway trains as I could. Thousands of messages in bottles cast into a sea of steel rails. This is both a plea and a warning. My plea is that you find my mother and tell her a white lie. Assure her that I love her and that I'm trying to come home. It might give her a sliver of hope or a touch of peace. I wish it were true, but here's the truth. I've envisioned myself like Odysseus, lost and adrift, seeking familiar shores. But I'm not lost at sea. I'm lost in endless tunnels, the labyrinth. This distinction matters because labyrinths are designed, constructed. Someone or something created this impossible place, and they must be held accountable for what they've done to me. They cast me as Theseus, not Odysseus, but I refuse to play that role any longer. The bizarre rules of this place have transformed me from the person I once was into something else entirely. They have turned me into a monster, and so I will embrace the role of the Minotaur in this labyrinth. If I can, I will tear this place apart and destroy those who built it. My warning to you is this: be extremely cautious around silent, expressionless men and women in public spaces. Keep your distance, they may kill you or inflict something far worse. If you spot them, run as far and as fast as you can. And above all, I implore you, do not ride the train to the end of the line. Credited to be. Originally uploaded on November 6, 2010. Thanks for joining us on this chilling journey through the labyrinth of the unknown. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories from the Mystery Shack. Remember, the next time you're on the subway, keep an eye out for the strangers. Stay curious, stay cautious, and we'll see you in the next video. Sweet dreams.